Most people see stinging nettle the same way they see a splintered fence or a patch of thorns. Something irritating, something to avoid, something to tear out before it spreads. In gardens and along roadsides, it is dismissed as a weed. But walk into any pharmacy or supermarket, and you will find shelves lined with bottles promising stronger bones, better joints, and the minerals modern bodies are told they lack. That contrast is the real story. In the 1940s, during a time of war, shortages, and strained medical supplies, people could not afford to ignore what grew around them. Doctors and field researchers were forced to look again at overlooked plants, not as nuisances, but as possible sources of nourishment and recovery. Among them was stinging nettle, Urtica dioica, a plant feared for its sting, yet respected in harder times for what it could provide. What changed was not the plant itself, but the way modern society learned to see it. Today, many people are willing to pay good money for nutrients that arrive in polished containers with scientific language on the label. Yet the plant that once offered some of those same nutrients has been reduced to something people spray, cut, and discard without a second thought. By the end of this video, you will understand why nettle was once valued, why that knowledge faded, and how people learned to harvest and prepare it safely in the first place. This is not just a story about one plant. It is a story about a habit of mind that modern life has quietly trained into people. When a nutrient comes in a bottle, with a clean label, dosage instructions, and a shelf price, it feels official. When that same value grows wild behind a shed, along a fence line, or near a garden path, it is treated as suspicious, primitive, or unsafe. The need itself never changed. People still want strong bones, better resilience, and dependable nourishment. What changed is the system built around that need. Modern commerce has a way of taking something basic, separating it from its natural context, packaging it, and selling it back as expertise. So the real question is not whether modern products have value. Some do. The real question is why so many people now trust what has been processed more than what is still alive. Are we actually becoming healthier or simply more dependent? Are we understanding nature more deeply, or are we just buying back tiny pieces of what earlier generations knew how to recognize for themselves when it stood before them? Most people know only half the story of stinging nettle. The first half is easy to remember. It is the sudden sting on bare skin, the sharp heat that lingers after brushing past a ditch, a field edge, or an overgrown corner of the yard. For many older viewers, it is the kind of childhood memory that never really leaves. Urtica dioica is common across temperate regions. It is a perennial plant, returning year after year, spreading by underground rhizomes, and often forming dense patches that are difficult to remove completely. That persistence is one reason people have long treated it like an enemy. But the sting itself is not a mystery, and it is not malice. The stems and leaves are covered with tiny hollow hairs, almost like fragile needles. When touched, their tips break, pierce the skin, and release irritating compounds that produce burning, itching, and prickling. It is an effective defense, nothing more. In a crowded landscape, a plant that cannot run must protect itself where it stands. So the fear is real. The discomfort is real. But that is still only half the story. The other half begins when people stop asking how it feels and start asking why generations kept gathering, cooking, and preserving it instead. For centuries, that question changed nettle from weed into resource. What matters here is that nettle did not survive in human memory by accident. It kept returning because people kept finding reasons to keep it. In monasteries, in rural households, and in poorer communities that could not afford waste, stinging nettle was never treated as a miracle. It was treated as something far more important, useful. People gathered it in spring, cooked it into soups and broths, dried it for later use, and understood it as part of the working knowledge of everyday life. That kind of knowledge becomes especially visible in hard times. During famine, war, and shortages, people stop asking whether a plant is fashionable and start asking whether it can nourish, strengthen, or sustain. In those moments, nettle appears again and again, not because people suddenly became romantic about weeds, but because hardship has a way of stripping away illusion. When resources are scarce, the real value of a plant is tested directly. And again, nettle proved that a feared plant could also be a practical one. But it would be wrong to describe it only as survival food. That makes it sound like a last resort, something people endured rather than respected. In truth, nettle had a broader place in older life. It was used in teas, in cooked dishes, and in some places even as a source of fiber. Its role was not limited to keeping hunger away. It belonged to a larger tradition of making full use of what the land offered. That is why its history matters. Nettle shows that earlier generations were not foolish, backward, or ignorant. They were often more observant than modern people, because they had to be. In easier times, societies forget the value of many things precisely because they seem too ordinary to matter. But in harsher times, illusion fades. And when it does, people return to what is genuinely useful. That is where nettle belongs, not in folklore alone, but in the long record of practical human judgment. What was lost here was not just a wild green people once cooked in spring. What was lost was the habit of looking at the natural world and recognizing value before someone else packaged it, labeled it, and sold it back. That loss did not happen all at once. It came through economics, culture, and the psychology of prosperity after hardship. After war and deprivation, many societies wanted distance from everything that reminded them of scarcity. Wild plants, improvised meals, and old survival knowledge belonged to a harder world people were eager to leave behind. Modern life promised something cleaner, easier, and more respectable. Food became standardized, agriculture industrialized, and nutrition increasingly separated from place, season, and memory. That shift changed more than convenience. It changed status. A plant growing freely in hedgerows could not be branded. It could not be stocked in predictable retail chains, marketed with modern imagery, or turned into steady revenue in the same way processed products could. And what cannot be commercialized easily is often treated as if it has little value at all. Culture reinforced the same lesson. Wild plants came to suggest poverty, roughness, and backwardness. Packaged goods suggested progress, cleanliness, and science. Many things do not disappear because they are useless. They disappear because they no longer fit the new economy. And once that happens, practical knowledge fades quietly, often before anyone realizes what has been surrendered. The interesting thing is not that nettle turns out to be magical. The interesting thing is that for a long time it was treated as nearly worthless, while its nutritional profile suggests the opposite. Modern science does not invent the value of Urtica dioica. It simply gives formal language to what earlier generations had already learned by use, habit, and necessity. Taken seriously, the data are hard to dismiss. Oregon State notes that cooked nettles provide calcium and manganese, while USDA-linked nutrition data for blanched nettles show unusually high calcium and vitamin K in a modest serving. That matters because it tells us this is not an empty weed with a romantic reputation. It is a plant with measurable nutritional density. Reviews of the literature also describe nettle leaves as containing iron, protein, carotenoids, phenolic compounds, and vitamins such as A, C, and K. In other words, nettle is nutritionally notable not because of one miracle property, but because its value is spread across useful categories. That combination is what makes the plant surprising. Calcium speaks to bone health. Iron matters because a food can only nourish well if it contributes to the body's mineral needs. Vitamin K is part of the conversation about bones and blood clotting. Protein, even when discussed by dry weight rather than servings, helps explain why nettle was respected as more than just a bitter spring green. Still, perspective matters. A nutrient profile on paper does not mean nettle replaces an entire diet, and it does not mean everyone should throw away supplements tomorrow. Preparation, quantity, overall diet, and individual health needs still matter. The stronger point is simpler than that. A wild plant once dismissed as primitive can, under serious examination, prove to be materially nourishing. That does not make nettle a cure-all. It makes it evidence that older food knowledge was often more practical and more observant than modern culture likes to admit. A wild plant does not enjoy the privileges of a crop bred for modern markets. Nobody selected stinging nettle to be sweeter, softer, prettier, or easier to ship across long distances without bruising. It had to survive on its own. It had to defend itself, compete for light, push through poor conditions, and adapt to whatever soil and weather it was given. That matters because a plant shaped by survival often develops a denser and more complex chemical profile than one shaped mainly for convenience. The sting itself is part of that story. So are the compounds that help the plant resist stress and persist where more delicate plants might fail. This does not mean every wild plant is automatically superior. It means selection has consequences. Modern agriculture has done remarkable things for yield, uniformity, and storage. But when a plant is optimized for appearance, transport, and mass sale, something else may be reduced along the way. Nettle reminds us that the wild is not always nutritionally poor. Sometimes it is concentrated because it had no choice. There is a real difference between romanticizing older ways of living and recovering older forms of competence. One is nostalgia. The other is the ability to care for yourself a little better. That is where nettle becomes practical. A bottle of supplements can cost 15, 20, sometimes far more over the course of a year. Nettle, by contrast, may already be growing nearby, or can be established easily in the right place if someone chooses to cultivate it intentionally. The point is not that a wild plant solves every nutritional problem. The point is that useful knowledge can lower dependence and reduce cost at the same time. But usefulness depends on judgment. First, the plant must be identified correctly. Second, it should be gathered from clean places, away from traffic, industrial runoff, or contaminated ground. Young tops are generally preferred. Gloves make harvesting simple, and a careful cut is enough. Once handled properly, nettle becomes far less intimidating. Heat neutralizes the sting. A brief blanch, a longer boil, drying, or cooking into soups and other dishes turns a painful plant into an edible one. From there, the uses are straightforward. It can be prepared much like spinach, steeped as tea, added to broths, dried for later use, or ground into leaf powder. None of this is exotic. None of it requires a fashionable movement. This is not about returning to the past. It is about recovering skills that never should have disappeared. For older households, that matters. A few skills, repeated season after season, can stretch a budget, restore confidence, and reconnect nourishment with place instead of packaging, branding, and the assumption that everything useful must be purchased. In that sense, nettle offers more than nourishment. It offers a small measure of independence in a world that increasingly expects people to buy back, piece by piece, what they once might have known how to gather, prepare, and use for themselves. The story of stinging nettle is not only about nutrition, it is about memory, judgment, and the way modern society learns to discard what it no longer knows how to price correctly. A useful plant is treated like a nuisance, cut down, sprayed, and cursed, while fragments of the same value are repackaged, labeled, and sold back at a premium. What has been forgotten is not just one plant. What has been forgotten is a way of seeing, a habit of paying attention, of recognizing usefulness, of staying close to the land instead of relying entirely on whatever appears on a shelf. And nettle is only one example. Many plants, foods, and old forms of practical knowledge have been pushed aside for being too ordinary, too cheap, or not modern enough to market well. If you want to keep rediscovering those forgotten resources, follow along, because there are many more waiting in plain sight than most people ever realize today.